be the same. Few people have been released. Few people screamed, most were silenced. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the king that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I think we've all thought about this in one way or another.
How many of you have read the graphic novel Watchmen or seen Zack Snyder's movie or the home box office television series? I hope many of you have, especially the graphic novel. It's definitely worth it. Well, one of the characters, perhaps one of the most identifiable, one of those you recognize at a glance, as the ancient Romans would have said, is Dr. Manhattan, or the reimagining of John Osterman, a physicist who fled with his family as a child from Nazi Germany and then became a great expert in physics until an unfortunate accident radically changes him, making him a true Superman. Well, this story, that of John Osterman and Dr. Manhattan, that name Manhattan, makes it clear that the author of the texts and characters of Watchmen, the English writer Alan Moore, was inspired by our protagonist today, a man who has been seen at times as a hero, at times as a traitor, a man who tried to warn the world about the most dangerous of his creations, a man who is a fundamental figure in the landscape of the Cold War, a man whose name has become synonymous with self-criticism after perhaps committing the most unforgivable mistake in history. A man named Robert Julius Oppenheimer. Of Oppenheimer, we perhaps know a very famous quote that is not even his. He simply reported the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred Hindu text that dates back over 2,000 years ago. The Gita is divided into 42 songs, each song in more verses, while the 11th song at the 32nd verse says, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oppenheimer quotes the Gita immediately after the Trinity test, July 16th, 1945. It's the test in the Albuquerque desert that marks the beginning of a new era, the nuclear era. It's a point of no return. Humanity has crossed that until then invisible boundary concerning the splitting of the atom, and from that moment forward, humanity itself will plunge headlong into a race on the edge of self-destruction. Oppenheimer understands it. He understands it very well. He was one of the fathers of that device, of that atomic bomb that will have to be used to bend Japan and force it to surrender. Oppenheimer knows it, but Oppenheimer is a very complex man. He is the son of German Jewish immigrants. They did not escape from Nazi Germany, as happened for Alan Moore's Dr. Manhattan, but they arrived in America a long time before. Oppenheimer is an American citizen in every respect. He studied in America first privately, then at the university. He also clashed with what we could call the ostracism of part of the American scientific community, an ostracism also based on racism. At a certain point, he is told that in a university in the physics department, one Jew is more than enough. This shows how much in certain environments that old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant legacy was still very much present and would only explode as a phenomenon in the 50s and 60s with the protests of the African American community. But Oppenheimer had been able to go far beyond the limitations due to his origins or the skepticism around him. As a young researcher, he had already managed to establish, together with another scholar, the Born-Oppenheimer paradox, a milestone in the history of physics. He had been given opportunities to work not only in America, but also in Europe, and For a certain period, he had moved to Europe and then returned home with the opportunity to teach and continue his research until the origin of his research, the nature of his research, the purpose of his research did not intersect with the war needs. The so-called Manhattan Project, one of the many top-secret projects of the United States of America to create high-potential weapons intended to win the Second World War. When the Manhattan Project starts, Oppenheimer is one of the first recruited. Why? Simply because he's brilliant. He's brilliant in his insights, he's brilliant in his work method, and he's also brilliant in his ability to coordinate the work of physicists from all over the world. The Manhattan Project isn't just made up of Americans. No, sir. There are Italians like Enrico Fermi, but there are also Austrians like Klaus Fuchs, who will later turn out to be a spy. And then there's the Dane Niels Bohr, who escapes from occupied Denmark and arrives in the United States in a roundabout way. And then there's also Ulam, the Pole. There are many of them. They are all there to work on that ultimate weapon. A weapon that requires the utmost security and control, especially from the civil and military authorities. It is at this moment that Oppenheimer clashes with the first distortions of what proclaims to be the land of the free, but freedom is managed a bit in its own way. Oppenheimer is initially accused of communist sympathy. Sure, he has the possibility of being covered. Brigadier General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, declares that he knows Oppenheimer's personal situation, is well aware of his associations outside the laboratories, but still issues him the highest security pass. This is because Oppenheimer is recognized as having a central and indispensable role in the Manhattan Project. Yet those associations will cyclically come back to haunt him. One of these is A. Associations is Jean Tetlock, his girlfriend for some stormy years. And the relationship ends. It ends badly, they argue. It is said that Tetlock goes to live with her landlady. It seems she is a lesbian. Surely Tetlock writes for a magazine, The Western Worker, which is also one of the press organs of the Communist Party of the United States of America. She died by suicide in 1944. Some say it's because of love issues. Others say it's because she couldn't accept something. When she, a psychologist, acknowledged her intrinsic homosexual nature, some even say she did it to avoid damaging Oppenheimer's career. Then there's Oppenheimer's wife, Kathleen, or rather Kitty. She, too, had been married for 6 months to a member of the Communist Party, also from the United States of America, and later dated another activist, again from the same party. It's a stain, but for the moment it's forgotten. Oppenheimer himself makes no secret of being a subscriber to People's World, a magazine also published by the Communist Party, and of having attended meetings to collect and then donate funds in favor of the Republican fighters in Spain during the Civil War. Fighters who are often Spanish, but there are also international brigades, but it should not be forgotten that in the Spanish Civil War there is a strong foreign interest, because if Franco's nationalists are supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the Republicans count on a support of arms, ammunition, and advisors from the Soviet Union itself. So, in America, helping the Republicans with fundraising can be seen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as Soviet sympathy, something to censor. Not only that, Robert Oppenheimer was also a member of the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union, an association and non-governmental organization, to promote civil liberties, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation at that time suspected it of being a sort of cover, a facade of the Soviets in the United States. The Red Scare manifests itself well before the 50s. It already arrives at the end of the 30s. Yet Oppenheimer, precisely because of his central role in the Manhattan Project, goes unscathed. He also goes unscathed through the friendship of Håkon Chevalier, a professor of Norwegian and French origins, a university professor of French language with clear Soviet sympathies, later accused of being even a recruiter of potential spies on behalf of the Soviet Union embassy in Washington. But as said, Oppenheimer manages to go unscathed. This phase works tirelessly on the Manhattan Project. a project that sees its realization first in the Trinity test of July 16th, 1945, and then in the two devastating explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, 145. At the Trinity test, Oppenheimer arrives at a deep personal crisis in body. For some time now, he has discovered mysticism, reads ancient Hindu texts in Sanskrit, and translates them. He utters two phrases after that Trinity test. One we have said is, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The other is perhaps even more disturbing and refers to that blinding glow that hits the polygon when the device is detonated on the metal tower on which it had been placed. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst into the sky, at once it would be like the splendor of the mighty is always the Bhagavad Gita, 11th chapter, 12th verse. Oppenheimer, sometime later in an interview, will justify those words. He said, "We knew that after that test, the world would never be the same again." Someone at that moment started to laugh. Someone else understood and started to cry. However, most people in the face of the power of that test simply remained silent. I wanted to remember, Oppenheimer said, the verse from the Hindu scriptures, the Gita. In that passage, Vishnu is trying to persuade Prince Arjuna to do his duty, and to impress him, he assumes his multi-armed form and says, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of all worlds." I suppose we all thought it a bit in that bunker when we saw the results of the test, in one way or another. When Oppenheimer utters these words, 20 years have already passed, 20 years since that Trinity test. Very troubled years for him, because his ordeal with the American military and political elite begins just a few weeks later. Oppenheimer takes responsibility for the dropping on Hiroshima. After all, he also realizes that the Japanese do not intend to surrender, and they must be forced in some way. But Oppenheimer himself immediately declares himself against the dropping of a second bomb on Nagasaki. There is no need for it. The world, not just the Japanese, has witnessed the type of weapon now possessed by the United States. Why drop another device? Moreover, being the second of only 3 available, there wouldn't have been any others immediately available. No, there was no need. Oppenheimer himself asks to be received at the White House, and when he speaks with President Truman, he reveals his enormous shame for having participated in the realization of such a monstrous project, for the creation of a weapon capable of destroying entire cities, and on a large scale to destroy the entire world. Truman reacts irritably. At the end of the meeting, he speaks with his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and tells him that he never wants to see that ugly face again. He actually uses a worse term, in the office, ever again. From that moment on, for Robert Oppenheimer, a real hell on earth begins. He is gradually excluded from military and political consensus. Then comes the era of McCarthyism. All those accusations of proximity to the Communist Party, which had been silenced for political reasons in order to develop the Manhattan Project, well, they reemerge one after the other and are exploited speciously to isolate Oppenheimer, even depriving him of the possibility of being able to really teach. Oppenheimer himself admits that deep down he knew about the communist faith of some of his friends, some of his acquaintances, or even some of his students at the university. But these are personal matters. He has never shown proximity to the Soviet Union. He is not a spy like Klaus Fuchs or Pontecorvo. No, he has simply done his job, even though he feels extreme shame about it. A fracture develops within the scientific community. Another researcher like Edward Teller even goes so far as to accuse Oppenheimer of being truly friendly with the Soviets. And those heavy words trigger a terrifying reaction, even in the academic world. Albert Einstein himself takes a stand in favor of Oppenheimer. He says that this witch hunt is something unworthy of America, and he knows it well. Einstein, who indeed escaped from Nazi Germany, knows well what it means to be persecuted for who you are and for your own ideas. Behind Einstein, a very solid block of university teachers and great professors forms, signing appeals for this witch hunt to end and for Oppenheimer to be rehabilitated. The witch hunt ends. It ends more than anything else because McCarthyism finds it's inglorious, but but fitting end when it is discovered that they are only the delusions of a few politicians and military men obsessed with a red danger that is much, much, much smaller than they can think. Oppenheimer has to wait a long time because it's not easy for him to return to teaching. He finds the doors barred, he finds embarrassed rectors, he even finds situations where he finds himself being both the object of the desire to know, but also pointed out as unwanted. He has to wait until the 60s. He has to wait for the presidency of Lyndon Johnson to get a real rehabilitation. Almost 20 years, such a long time. The widow of President Kennedy will later reveal that her husband wanted to rehabilitate Oppenheimer. After all, Kennedy, even before becoming president as a senator, had opposed one of Oppenheimer's major accusers, but that presidential pardon, or rather that rehabilitation, had never arrived. Oppenheimer will live the last years of his life aware that he has done his duty, including opposing the warmongers by warning about the risks of creating the hydrogen bomb. The real end-of-the-world device, to quote that other beautiful film, which is Dr. Strangelove. However, Oppenheimer will see his efforts frustrated by ambition, by the will of the military spheres, to have an ever more powerful weapon in order to exercise a position of strength and a continuous arm wrestling with the adversary. In 65, Oppenheimer discovers he is sick, he has terminal cancer. It is due to his only vice, smoking. He has always smoked a lot. He commits until the last day to make known the critical conscience, what in Italy Rita Levi Montalcini calls the ethics of the scientist. That aspect, much more philosophical, but first of all moral, which should impose a discipline on those who explore science, understanding that certain limits should never be crossed. Oppenheimer falls into a coma and dies in 1967. He leaves behind the legacy of the nuclear age, an era that, as we have said, completely overwhelms human life. However, allow me a closing reflection. It's true, Robert Oppenheimer paid, as he himself said, the sin that the cast of scientists knew by creating that bomb, but Robert Oppenheimer also taught something. He taught that the dignity of the scientist, the dignity of his ideas, the dignity of his morals, of his ethics, is superior to any interest, perhaps even the strategic interest of a nation. First and foremost, that sense of humanity must come. Here we must never give up. Everyone is just small. This is the real lesson of Robert Oppenheimer, and this is what we all should strive to do every day.
I knew that the world would not be the same. Few people relaxed. Few people screamed. Most people were silenced. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the king that he should do his duty, and to impress him, he takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." And I think we've all thought about it one way or another.